All right, let's talk about scaling solutions. So on blockchain, we've got these different terms: L1, L2, sidechain, drivechain. It's alphabet soup of a lot of different terms. They all kind of have the same idea about what they're trying to do. And I thought it would be cool to have a discussion about this today. Lucas, I know that you've interacted with some L2s. I think the most famous one is probably Lightning on Bitcoin. And I always look to Bitcoin as the place where a lot of the ideas start. It's kind of the granddaddy of all blockchains. It's not saying that all innovations start with Bitcoin, but certainly seems a lot of them do. And so the first real scaling solution that started to take off, I think, was Lightning, and it's still a pretty popular one. I've worked with Lightning quite a bit. Have you had a chance to ever do a Lightning transaction, Lucas?
Never have. I've used Bitcoin. I'm familiar with some of the problems with the settlement time in Bitcoin, but no, I've never used Lightning whatsoever.
So a Lightning transaction is really fundamentally at its core a way to scale. So the thing that you can think about with Bitcoin is we produce a block every 10 minutes. And what that fundamentally means is if you want to do a transaction, then you get into a block because you paid a fee. And then usually what you want to have happen to ensure that whatever money you've transferred is really settled the way that you want it to have finality. And by these words, settled and finality, I mean, when we transact cash, like if I am standing next to you and you give me, a dozen ears of corn and I give you some amount of fiat in cash, when I have the corn and you have the cash and we both walk away, barring you pulling a gun on me or something like that, right? We have finality in our transaction. I've got the corn, you got the money. You're a farmer. I'm somebody who is not a farmer. I've got cash. You want the cash. You want to sell your corn. You want to go buy something else, pay off debts. We have finality when we each walk away with the thing that we wanted. And so in Bitcoin, when we have this idea of finality, there's something that can happen with blockchains, and it's such that you want to wait for that block that has the transaction to be buried, which means that there are some amount of blocks that sit on top of it, and that you can, with confidence, find your transaction in a block after some period of time, and there are some amount of blocks that sit on top of you. Because in a blockchain, what we're doing is we're creating blocks over time. So this is what the consensus mechanism is doing. We've got all these ASICs out here. They're computing the SHA-256 hash, and when somebody finds the correct solution to the problem that's been proposed to the peer-to-peer network, they can create a block. They swoop up all the transactions that are in the mempool, and then they create that block. And so as that goes on over time, then your transaction gets what they call buried. And that means that there have been blocks that have been created after it. And the reason you want to wait for this is because there are certain conditions that can happen where there will be a temporary split in the chain. And it could be that your coin transaction might not actually make it in. And it has to do with some really esoteric stuff that can occur. But what it means is that even though we create a block every 10 minutes, we're not really final until later on. And there are certain safety conditions that you need to wait for. And so if you send money around in the world of crypto, sometimes you'll see things in your UI waiting for confirmations or waiting for whatever, and it can take some amount of time. And in Bitcoin, it can be on the level of hours. And so if you're thinking about somebody who's trying to sell coffee or trying to sell corn, it's not easy to think that you would sit there and wait for a couple of hours, twiddling your thumbs while the blockchain's doing its thing and there's this peer-to-peer network that's doing whatever. We want to be able to walk into a coffee shop, order a coffee, walk out, and have that happen within seconds, at most minutes. And so fundamentally, what an L2 is about is making it so that we can have transactions that finalize more quickly, or that we can have more of them that happen. Bitcoin has a limitation, like it has a certain amount of size. You can only have a certain amount of transactions that could be in a block. So as people started to think, well, can Bitcoin be the currency of the entire world? If you think about how many transactions are happening on this planet, if we're going to use one global monetary system, having 7 transactions per second is not going to fit the bill. There's got to be a way to scale it. And so that's really what it comes down to when we're talking about scaling on Bitcoin, or if we're talking about scaling on Ethereum. This is what L2s are intended to produce. Is it's a way to make transactions happen faster and happen at scale, and they leverage the L1 to make that happen. So when we talk about an L1, we're talking about the blockchain itself. So this is Bitcoin or Ethereum or Chia or whatever. Pick your favorite blockchain that has a token, that has a consensus mechanism. That's the L1. If you build something on top of the L1, that is called a layer two. And it really borrows from this concept of networking, because in networking, we have this layered stack of how we build up a protocol for how we have computers talk to each other. And so it's this idea of layering or protocols that you can build on top of each other, and they leverage something underneath. So one of the most famous ones would be something like TCP/IP. We usually just lump those together, but they're something different. Like each of those is a different layer, and you can do different things on top of the IP protocol, because you can do TCP and you can do UDP, and there's a whole bunch of different stuff that you can do on top of each of these different layers. And so, in a similar fashion, we've designed blockchains and we've contemplated building solutions in blockchain that allow for this kind of layering mechanism. And so, an L2 is fundamentally about achieving some higher amount of scale, some higher throughput. Now, there's been a division in the world of Bitcoin about how do you actually achieve scalability. So something like Solana says, nah, we're not going to do this layer two scaling thing. We're just going to have the L1 run really, really fast. Sometimes I refer to that as running hot. And the reason I would call it running hot is because you have to have a sufficiently beefy machine. You have to have a lot of space. You have to have a lot of CPU. You have to have a lot of RAM to achieve a layer one network that runs at that kind of scale. So if you want to have a really fast L1, then the requirements for everybody that is running the consensus mechanism, that's running the network, goes up substantively. So if you have a network that exists, that something like Bitcoin or Chia, that presumes and aspires to have minimum spec, like Bitcoin really prides itself on the fact that you can run Bitcoin Core on a Raspberry Pi. Now, that doesn't mean that you can participate in consensus at that level, but you can at least replicate the database and look at transactions, and you can have a level of privacy by running a node, because you can hook your wallet up to that node. But if you are going to do something like Solana, you can't even run a private node without having a lot of investment in the hardware and the equipment that's required to run Solana, because it just has that high of requirements. And in our discussions about Cardano is kind of the similar way. Like, you can't just have this tiny little machine that runs Cardano. You have to have a sufficiently powerful machine to be able to even have a node that runs Cardano. So layer twos are intended to leverage that security and that infrastructure of the L1 and achieve some higher level of transmission and some faster transactions and quicker finality, while assuming that that L1 continues to exist. So I guess I'll just pause right there and see if all that made sense, or if you had any questions about any of that, Lucas or Rusty.
It makes a lot of sense, but a couple of questions do occur because as you're talking about the syncing of the L2 and running a layer 2 blockchain that can run faster, what sort of information needs to be synced up with that L2? And maybe I'm skipping ahead and asking that, but And also, is there different information, the coin spins or what have you, that need to be conveyed to the blockchain to be settled out, or the L1 blockchain, in a coin set and an account model?
Well, usually what happens with an L2 or a payment channel is sometimes how this will be referred to. There are differences in how like payment channels or state channels work, and side chains and drive chains. So these all have different flavors, and they fundamentally are trying to achieve different goals. Like they have designs for exactly how they're working, and some of the ways that the minutia of the protocol work. So it's kind of funny when you have L and then the number two, and then you have something called ELTOO. And this was intended to say, well, there's some difference, but they're kind of the same thing. So they're peers. So this is kind of in the same way that TCP and UDP are kind of peers at the same level, but they're different. So they have different ways that they work. They have different designs. They have different things that they're trying to optimize for. And in the difference between, say, like Lightning and Bolt on the Bitcoin network, they have differences in their design. They have differences in their implementation, but they're fundamentally trying to achieve a very similar thing. And so, when we talk about what's happening inside of that and how do they interact with the L1, these these L2s, these layers that exist on top of the canonical blockchain, what they're doing is they're allowing you to transact in the native coin using the native token infrastructure that exists on the L1, but you're doing it at a different with different parameters, right? So maybe you make blocks faster, maybe you have some considerations for how things go, but fundamentally you're working with stuff that was created on the L1 or that has the ability to interoperate with the L1. It's very rare, and I'm not even sure if I've ever heard of one where you couldn't reconcile something that happened on an L2 of a blockchain back to the L1. I think that might not even be possible, but I don't want to rule it out that it could never happen, but I'm not familiar with it, and it would be very uncommon. So for instance, how does Lightning Network work? So how Lightning Network works is you have to start with some amount of Bitcoin. And this is referred to as the liquidity problem of Lightning. Because to open some Lightning channel, let's say that you were at a coffee shop and you want to be able to transact at some high speed, then what you've got to do is open the register. So you can really think about it like that, right? When you're working at a retail job and you're doing that in cash. Now, this is not how a lot of people experience retail, but I think enough of us have experienced this, or maybe some place where you deal mostly in cash. So think about like the farmer's market, right? Maybe some people are processing electronic payments at a farmer's market, but I think a lot of times what they're doing is they're participating in cash. So the farmer or the representative of the farmer that's sitting there with all the produce has a wad of cash in his hand. That is his ability to make change, right? You walk up at the 20, you want to buy some amount of corn and you need to make change. Well, the way that you're going to interact with that person is they've got to have a wad of cash in their pocket. If they have no wad of cash in their pocket, you have to walk up with exact change, and it's like just not really going to work. And this is a bit of an analogy, so it breaks down a little bit, but that's essentially how you can think about it: is you've got to have some amount of liquidity. You have to have some amount of money within this L2. Otherwise, you don't have any ability to interact in the L2. There has to be money there. And so when you open one of these L2s, when you open a payment channel, you open it by trapping a certain amount of Bitcoin in a very special way on the L1. And then because it's trapped there, it's now available to be traded on the L2. And when you want to close the payment channel, that's when you can get this money back. And so the idea on Lightning is that you would open one of these payment channels, and it would be a way you could get rent on your Bitcoin. It would be a way that you could make money by not having your Bitcoin at risk. You're essentially borrowing it into this payment channel. People are transacting and doing stuff. And then when the payment channel gets closed down, there's some amount of fees that would be collected during all of these transactions, and you'd get all of it or a big portion of it or whatever amount. And so that's kind of the idea for how things work on an L2 is you trap the coins, then you're doing some interactions according to the rules of whatever the L2 is, and then at whatever point when the payment channel is closed, then the money that was trapped in a particular way is returned back to the people who rented it out plus some amount. So does that kind of make sense about like how it's working? Like you can't really create new token inside the L2. You can create some new stuff. Like it is possible to create NFTs and do some other kind of weird things and resolve them back to the original chain, but you can't create new Bitcoin on Lightning. You have to place it into that liquidity network, and then it can all get moved around into different hands. And then when you reconcile it back out to the L1, then sort of that's when things get resolved appropriately and the payment channel gets closed down.
Absolutely makes sense. And I hadn't heard of the liquidity problem of Lightning, but I understand that. Are there discussions about other L2s that might, because a blockchain is and accounting is just telling a story about something, and we think about it so many times in terms of transactions, a record of things that have happened before. But in the real world, we also have billing. And are there any L2s that are operating on a concept of billing and having the parties who have engaged in it settle out whenever the information is being recorded back on the L1?
By billing, do you mean like me to give you some sort of an invoice and say you need to pay me this amount, and it's like a smart contract that says this is the amount I want you to pay me, and we can settle it when you've actually paid the correct amount?
Yes.
Yeah, that's there's a thing called the Lightning Network invoice, and that is definitely a thing that you can do. Yep.
Okay. Well,
And it's been one of the ways that we've been able to do atomic swaps. Actually, that's how I implemented atomic swaps between Lightning and Chia.
well, that's good to hear that, because it would seem to solve the quote unquote. And I mean, I get why you would want both, but I'm glad to hear that that L2s are being generated that have more than just a concept of transactions incorporated into them. But I also know that Lightning has been problematic for some reasons on Bitcoin. Is that because of it's out of cadence with settling with Bitcoin because or is it a problem like finding the liquidity of a large group of people who are using the L2? Like, why is it a problem?
Lightning's got some weird design to it. It like has directionality. So there's some weird ways that Lightning operates, and it has to do with the fundamental nature of the way it was designed. And so it's like there's a route in Lightning, and essentially the money starts kind of on the left hand side, and it flows towards the right. And like once the money starts flowing to the right, it can't go backwards. And I'm kind of shorthanding some of it, but like it has to do with routing. It has to do with the way that Lightning is designed, and it's some of the trade-offs that Lightning put in place to achieve this faster stuff. And it's been the criticisms of Lightning is that it's got these weird esoteric rules. It's got these really weird ways that it operates, and it just doesn't do the thing that you would expect. Some people would just say, well, what an L2 on top of Bitcoin should be is it should just be Bitcoin, but faster, right? Like it should just be the same thing, and it shouldn't have all these weird, liquidity problems and rules and stuff like this. And so this has been like the criticism of Lightning is that it doesn't really operate like Bitcoin. And that's the thing about an L2 is it really has no resemblance to the L1 unless the person who designed it makes it that way. So when you're creating this upper level protocol or this protocol that sits on top of the L1, it leverages the security of the L1. Now we'll get into that in more detail. What do I mean by the security of the L1? But fundamentally, when you're operating on one of these L2s, they don't have to adhere to the fundamental rules of the L1 in any way. And so you have to look at the very particular details of the L2 and decide if you want to participate in that network, just the same as you have to decide if you want to participate in the rules of whatever blockchain or L1 that you're working on. Like if you look at a blockchain and you're like, wow, that proof of stake thing seems really shaky and dubious. I don't know if that really produces the level of security that I want. Then you might say, well, that's not the blockchain for me. I want a blockchain that's proof of work and it's decentralized, and I want to make sure that what I'm doing is really fundamentally the thing that I thought it was going to be. But with an L2, you have to look at it in all the same ways. You have to do all those same analyses because an L2 gets to set its own rules. It's ultimately like a new blockchain that just exists on top of the other one. But what it doesn't need to do is fundamentally produce like the layer one security and consensus mechanism. So L1s have all these properties, and then an L2 has the ability to set a whole bunch of stuff, but it borrows or inherits some of the stuff from the L1, but it can fundamentally change a whole bunch of rules about how things work. So you really have to think hard and look at what you're transacting on, and you have to understand how it works to know what you're getting into on that particular L2, because they do have different behaviors. And so some of the criticisms that have been leveled against Bitcoin's popular L2, which is Lightning, there are folks who have been working on a different kind of L2, and this is this ELTOO. And so I think one of the popular ones that people have been looking at is something like the Bolt network.
And you said that Lightning has directionality. Is that because is that to ensure or to make sure that double spins don't occur? Is why did it have directionality? And then, not to throw two questions at you, but does Bolt have directionality, or is that is it doing it in a different way?
Um, I the reason it has directionality is for like routing purposes. I don't. It's probably a little bit beyond the scope. Like we'd have to get into the details, particularly of like why. Like why is always a very interesting question about like why would you do this thing or the other thing, right? It's usually has some there's a limitation you're trying to deal with it, or there's something that it isn't easy to do without solving it in a much more difficult or intense way, and so it's a trade-off. But we'd probably have to spend the entire time of this conversation just talking about Lightning, its design, its trade-offs, like what were the reasons why things were done. It's probably just a bit beyond the scope unless we're just doing a super technical show. So I'd say the why question is always one of the hardest to answer, but like why was it done this way? Like why would you do this? It's just it's a hard thing to contemplate without getting into the real minutia of the protocol.
Well, what about Bolt then? What is Bolt doing that's different? And does Bolt have this directionality that the Lightning Network has?
It's it's like again, we'd have to just like kind of break it down one by one about like why the things are different, like what's happening, right? So at its top level, I can just say what Bolt says about itself, right? But again, we'd have to like get into real nitty gritty details about like what is the difference and why would you want to use one or the other, and what are they trying to achieve with the differences. And I think for this particular conversation, I'm trying to stay a little bit higher level. But if we want to do that more technical deep dive, I think we should do that. But let me prep for it a bit more than just like saying we're going to do a rundown of like what are these things at a high level and what are they at the more minutia.
Okay, I'm down with that. Um I want yeah, let's keep it to L2s. I thought those might be fairly easy.
They're not bad questions. They're just like to give it a good answer. It's like I want to make sure that I have the right documentation in front of us, right? And like we can say because a lot of the criticisms of the Lightning Network, right? What's been levied against it? Like, why do we want to do something slightly different? It usually gets into the technical details, right? It's not just something you can at a top level just say, oh yeah, well, we're going to do this different. Like, we're going to get rid of that directionality. That was dumb. It's like that. It wasn't dumb. It was like there was a reason why we needed to have that. And there's a reason why it's part of the design. Otherwise, those flaws would have been removed when they were originally first cooked. And some of this has to do with the march of time, right? We're just learning how to do things better, or we're looking at how the flaws in certain things exist, and we're saying, well, let's try to do something different or better than what we've done before. But it takes time to sort of understand how you could even do it different, when the first scaling solutions that existed on top of blockchains didn't have the full purview of everything that's come after it.
Well, and just to move on to Bolton, because from what it says about itself, reusable payment requests, increased privacy, increased censorship resistance. Are there other L2s that are growing on the Bitcoin network, or is it essentially Lightning and Bolt, and they are looking for to use Bitcoin for more transactions? And I say that because I don't see a lot about NFTs or smart contracts with them.
Well, those are different things. Like, we're not really talking about NFTs here today. So an NFT is a special kind of data that gets put on the chain, right? What we're talking about here today is like a way to increase the throughput of a particular blockchain by creating a protocol on top of it. So what we're talking about today are protocols, different ways to interact with the base layer to do something that's kind of fundamentally different. We talk about something like a smart contract or an NFT. You can do that on the L1, and you can do it on the L2 as well, as long as they're fundamentally compatible, which they usually are. So it's more about speed, scalability, throughput, and putting some other types of properties into what you're doing in this protocol that you build on top of it. And so that's why what we've got in the title of the conversation is L2 sidechain Drivechain, because these things are all kind of peers of each other. The smart contracts and the NFTs are different types of what Bitcoin has traditionally called a colored coin, or a way to do a special kind of coin spend or transaction that exists on top of what would be a normal kind of transaction. So as Ethereum, we have just ETH, and you can use it to have a store of value, and you can use it to pay the gas fees for doing things on the network. You have to make special kinds of contracts and different kinds of token standards if you want to do this other kind of stuff. And so that doesn't really hit the level of protocol, because protocol means that we're trapping stuff in a very particular way, so we can alter the rules of how fast the chain moves, or its particular properties of how two users can interact without having to adhere to the constraints of whatever is happening on the L1.
Okay, that makes sense. So the L2s are protocols for moving coins in a different way, generally faster, and the NFT contract is all about stamping or recording information in the coins. So you've said sidechain and drivechain. What's the difference between sidechains and drivechains?
Well, just to round out this idea, so the whole idea of a colored coin, right, was one of the first ideas for how you could create digital tokens. And so this idea of a colored coin is this thought that you could take some Bitcoin, some sats, and you could say paint it red or paint it green, and make something like a digital collectible. So like this idea of doing digital collectibles was the idea of doing NFTs. So if you think about NFTs, or like airline miles or reward points, what in the Chia world we would call cats, right? Even when they first launched, they were actually called colored coins. So Bitcoin's been thinking about colored coins and doing pretty much everything that we have been doing in the modern blockchain world with respect to NFTs and ERC20s and all this stuff. Like, Bitcoin's been thinking about that stuff since its inception. So these are not new concepts, but they are distinct and different from what we're talking about with respect to L2s and side chains and drive chains, because you can have these ideas of colored coins, and in the Lightning Network it is entirely possible that you could be moving those things around on that payment channel, that you could use the payment channel to move those different types of assets around. That's entirely possible. So the L2 is not the colored coins, it's not the digital collectibles, it's not the NFTs. It's a protocol for how to increase the scalability and throughput of the L1.
Okay, gotcha. But back to sidechain, what is and drive chains? What are the differences between side chains versus drive chains?
So when we started to talk about chains, this is really kind of, we're starting to diverge significantly from just trapping coins. So in Lightning, what we are doing is we're saying we're gonna trap some amount of Bitcoin, and we're gonna put it on the L1 in a way that it provides liquidity to this secondary thing, and that secondary thing doesn't necessarily have its own consensus mechanism, particularly. Like, it doesn't necessitate you running hardware to do something. And that's why people started using this word chain in what they were doing to make something that sits adjacent to an L1. So that's kind of the way that I think fundamentally about like side chains and drive chains, is you're starting to have something that exists next to the main chain, the blockchain, and it has some way that it's creating blocks and doing stuff. But now you're saying, okay, we're going to have a lot of those same concepts with blocks and all the rest of this stuff, and it's going to inherit and split off from the main thing and run parallel to it, and it can interact with it in some particular way. So like, you could say, I'm going to have a side chain or a drive chain that's operating parallel to Bitcoin. It's going to have its own rules, a bunch of consensus mechanism and all this stuff, and it has a way that it can fundamentally interoperate with the Bitcoin L1 in a way that it makes things seamlessly move back and forth. And the reason people are thinking about doing this is because they don't want to create like another blockchain, like something that's different from Bitcoin. What they want to do is augment it in some way. And so you can think about like something that you might want to do, right? Let's say that you want to do stock trading, right? But you want to do stock trading in a way that looks just like Bitcoin, right? So if you wanted to do that, you would need to have a chain that ran really, really hot, but maybe it only runs hot during a specific period of time, and you could close it on a daily basis. So think about how the stock market works, right? It opens at 9 a.m. and it trades for 6 hours or whatever. And at the end of the day, you've got to settle out all the stock trades that happen, and everybody has to get their stock and what have you. If you think about like how that's working, I mean, it kind of feels like it's some kind of payment channel or side chain or whatever that's operating with these different rules, because you want it to operate at super high speed. It only has to exist for a certain period of time, and then you could close it back out. So the idea of running some sort of side chain would be if you would have some consensus mechanism or some kind of hardware that is responsible for running next to it, but then that you're fundamentally interacting with and resolving back to the main chain at some cadence. And so some of these chains and some of the things that have been proposed have the ability to resolve instantaneously. So you could just jump between the two. So there's ways that you can interact between the two things without closing them. And some of the things that people have talked about doing are like having windows of time that exist where these things are operating, and then they close out after they're complete. And so this is like at a high level what we're thinking about and what people are designing when they're talking about creating like a side chain or a drive chain. And some of the things that have stymied this, that have made it not easy to do it on Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin has a limitation in the amount of scripting that it's got. So it's hard to do some of the things that people have wanted to do because they are missing some of the programmability that's needed on Bitcoin to enable you to do side chains and drive chains as people have expressed them. And so this is where when we were talking a while ago about the great script restoration, it's saying if we were to add some additional opcodes onto Bitcoin, then we would be able to do something like a side chain or a drive chain. And some people in Bitcoin find that very distasteful. Like it's been sort of the block size wars of our generation or the last few years is whether any of this should exist or whether it should be done in a different way, and that Bitcoin sort of is fine how it is, and we don't need to upgrade it. And so that's some of the stuff that's going on with side chains and drive chains is it's something like what I just described. See here, I've got that on the screen in this little blurb is it's a scaling solution that runs parallel to the main chain, independent and separate, and it has its own coin and consensus mechanism, but it's linked to the main chain, and you can transfer assets between the two. So you see how all that stuff that I just kind of described about how that stock trading thing might work operates on a side chain.
Absolutely. But what about drive chains? What's the distinction between? Why are they different?
Well, there are like differences in what you're trying to achieve. Like it's like a side chain is where you're saying it's like its own consensus mechanism, but like a drive chain is I'm trying to think of a way to make the simple distinction. I'd say for the sake of this discussion, probably just think about them in the same way. The differences are very esoteric. Let me put it that way. They're very esoteric. Like, why does it even have a different name? Like, I think that you could almost collapse them into the same thing for the sake of like what we're talking about today. Like it's not like strictly true, but like again, we're gonna have to get way into the technical weeds to really understand it, and it's gonna be about opcodes and all kinds of different crap, and like that's probably not super productive unless we're like breaking down what is the difference between a drive chain and a side chain. And I'm pretty sure I could find an article that specifically talks about that, but it's going to lead to a whole bunch of very technical questions that are probably not super useful for this discussion. But like the reason this is different than like say a payment channel is that the payment channel doesn't really have its own consensus mechanism. It doesn't have its own token. It doesn't have its own hardware requirements and all that kind of stuff. Even though when you're running an L2, there are some things you have to keep track of and whatever, but it's not on the same level of like what's happening on a side chain. And so I would really say like Lightning is never going to achieve something like a stock trading infrastructure, whereas something like a side chain or a drive chain could very easily and conceivably facilitate something like that, trading a real world asset like a futures or a derivative market or a stock market. You could envision doing that on a side chain or a drive chain, where a Lightning network or a payment network is more suited towards something like I'm going to run my coffee shop or my farmer's market. And so it's these analogies of like what it is that you're trying to achieve really tells you about like what is it that drives the design for what you're trying to achieve. Because if you think about, well, I want to achieve X, what is it going to take me to do that using blockchain technology? That's why certain things exist. So you can think about Lightning as like the way that I open my cash drawer for doing a coffee shop or my farmer's market, and then you can think about a drive chain or a side chain. Like, how would I do something as grandiose as trying to do a derivatives market or a futures market or a stock trading market using blockchain technology?
Well, and good to know that because that was you foresaw my next question, and I was going to ask about payment channels. Are payment channels side chains, but they don't have payment channels don't have a consensus mechanism or their own native coin. So when we're talking about side chains, we're talking about, say, on Ethereum, we're talking about Polygon and Base. Those are because they have their own consensus mechanism and they have their own they have their own token on that L2.
These are getting into like really weird taxonomies. It's like this would be the kind of questions about whether when you'd say like is this thing a bird or a reptile, right? At like the Cambrian age, it's like a matter of debate of like whether you define things a certain way. You probably have quite a bit of disagreement from certain people about how these things are referred to and thought about. Like these words, sidechain and drivechain, really come from discussions and designs that are happening within the Bitcoin community. I don't know that the folks that are over on the Ethereum side of things would really think about it that way, because they have an account model, and when you have the difference between an account model and a coin set model, or a UTXO or an EUTXO model, you start to have a lot of differences in the way that these things would fundamentally exist and interoperate. So I don't know, like maybe, but I bet you'd get a lot of different answers from a lot of different people if you posed that particular question.
Well, and I did wonder if the account model, how that played out in difference to the coin set model. So what are side chains that are on the Bitcoin network now? Like anything come to mind, or is this just like being built and they don't?
So these things are being experimented with on Bitcoin's testnet. So there are testnets that have been spun up where some of the opcodes that are needed to do drive chains and side chains exist, and so they've been experimenting with it there. I think that some of the other forks of Bitcoin that have more of the scripting enabled on it have also been goofing around with this stuff, but I haven't been in the nitty gritty of some of that stuff, so I don't know exactly where the most popular place where people have been experimenting with drive chains and side chains are particularly. But let me look one or two of them up so I can throw it on the screen.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rusty. What following along, or are what do you think?
Yeah, I'm following along. It's a great conversation. I'm learning more about L2s and how they work at the fundamental level. The thing about me is with L2s, do they really try to bring the value to their items, like because they're built on top of the other chain? Like when you think about L2s, I've never really like, I don't know if we want to go into the conversation of NFTs and stuff like that, but you don't really hear about things on L2s that have great value besides the L2 chain itself. Like I've never really seen an L2 like on base or Polygon that's really become major within itself. There might be a few base like meme coins that are really taken off, but I don't know if that's kind of the same thing I'm talking about.
Well, that is. I think if we get there, because I think that we're going to see a change in the in how we see value assigned or understood with regards to blockchains, because with the regulatory sort of wall that was set around blockchains, we saw the coin investment model instead of stocks in a company. So I think that's been corrupted in the early days of blockchain, and we'll see. I think that we'll see more value actually coming to blockchains because of the L2s and and their use. So, but that's my own personal guess. But what do you got here, Grant?
Well, this is the opcode that's or it's the Bitcoin Improvement Proposal. So it's the BIP. It's BIP 300 that talks about what is needed to make this stuff fundamentally work. I was just doing some other research to pop up, like to answer your other question. I think this is the one that I think Liquid might be a chain that is actually a side chain. I'm not sure. The question you asked, I just wasn't. I guess I probably should have just prepped by like having a couple of examples of these things. It should have been obvious, but I'm not. Not.
Would you hover back over those partners? You scrolled right by it, and Rusty, to your question too. I think what we're going to see, as we saw earlier, when you brought up the Wikipedia article, and it talked about how would different companies record their loyalty points, et cetera, et cetera. And so in one way we think about converting Bitcoin to dollars, but in another way we think about the tokens as being the cost for having transactions on a network. And as we have more layer twos that exist on a blockchain that need those tokens to complete their transactions, that's another way of seeing what value that they have. And so as you see more L2s and more use in that regard on a network, I think that is going to be I think that to me that's a truer approximation on a value rather than hype and watching the markets. So that was probably anathema to most Bitcoin holders.
I'm pretty sure that liquid is what we would consider to be a side chain. Yeah, I think this is one of them. I probably need to do a bit more reading up on this to actually get to the point where I could say for sure. But I think this is an example of one. But as far as reading up more on this stuff, like this was this was the discussion that had come up about whether we were going to adopt BIP 300 and allow for side chains. But this is sort of the motivation of it, which is what I was talking about. And really that was where I wanted to keep the conversation was, what is the motivation? What are these things at a high level? Probably could have a follow-on discussion where we just start to go through, what actually would be classified into each of these, and examples on different chains and how some of them are being successful or not successful. That sounds like an interesting discussion. Maybe we could go through that at some point.
Well, we'll have to do a little bit of research because I'm pretty unfamiliar with them. I knew of Lightning, but not of the side chains and drive chains. And you mentioned this BIP 300. This is what is the BIP 300?
It's the improvement proposal. So remember when I said, like, you really can't do side chains and drive chains on Bitcoin the way it exists now? Maybe I blew past that too fast. You really can't do side chains and drive chains on Bitcoin right now. It's not possible.
And is BIP 300 something that the Great Script Restoration, is this one of the opcodes that they're hoping to add to it, or are they focused on getting NFTs and that scripting language?
Great Script Restoration would enable a variety of things, including drive chains. So they sort of swoop up what would be in here. So there are these different proposals out there for changes that could be made to Bitcoin from a technical level. And BIP 300 is like the minimum one proposed by, I think, Paul Stork, I think, is the author of this. And he's proposing like the minimum set. Yeah, this guy, Paul Stork. I don't know exactly that's the way that you pronounce his name, but he's the one that proposed BIP 300 as a way to just enable drive chains itself. So Great Script Restoration would be bigger than just BIP 300. It would probably encompass it.
And what is the conversation amongst the Bitcoin community? Is this close to adoption, or is there still a lot of pushback? Like you mentioned that there's pushback with the addition of the opcodes with the Great Script Restoration.
I don't think that we have anywhere even close to consensus about changes that might happen to Bitcoin any time in the near future. This is somewhat what's referred to as the ossification of Bitcoin. Ossification is where something turns to bone over time, I think is where that comes from. It just means that, like, it's not really changing anymore. We haven't had substantive things happen on Bitcoin that people have really accepted in a while, and so I don't think we're really that close to it. But there's definitely a lot of saber rattling in Bitcoin about trying to get some of this stuff through, because people really, really want to develop on what they consider to be the best blockchain, and some of the innovative things that have been able to be done on other blockchains have not been possible on Bitcoin because we're missing some of these opcodes.
Well, how do you see that happening? I mean, is it the likes of Chia getting greater adoption and people seeing what's going on with a different blockchain? I mean, Chia, Cardano, any other blockchain. Although I'm sure the decentralization of a proof of stake, probably Bitcoiners might discount that. But is it that, or do you think that there is going to be that there's going to be fluctuation in the I don't know, the dollar evaluation of the exchange rate of Bitcoin because interest in the market goes towards other chains?
I think the motivation is to try to solve real world problems. This is the reason why people are pursuing this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of cross pollination between various developers looking at what people have tried, what they propose, the different designs, and saying, could we do this here? Would this work over here? What would we have to do to make this work? And some of it is like the fundamental difference between account model chains and coin set model chains that drive some of these things. So for instance, what Bram's working on with respect to state channels on Chia, he's stated that he borrows very heavily from what's already occurred on Lightning. So, he's said that pretty concretely. So I think a lot of these things are, everybody looks at what everybody else is doing, and we're all trying to advance the state of the art together. And so at conferences, this is where these ideas are published, and this is where these discussions happen. And then on various different chains, testnets, and whatever, is where people try to prove these things out. And once you achieve some level of documented success, that's when you come back and you give these proposals for how to make changes. And this is the process. But these processes are slow and takes time to come to a general consensus about whether this is the right thing, because sometimes making changes like this have unintended consequences. Like, you might say, well, we want to do this for side chains, but it actually allows you to do other stuff that people might find extremely distasteful. So I think SegWit is a good example of something that got into Bitcoin, and then you have people like the Taproot wizards that created NFTs, and people cried that was spam and garbage on the chain. So it's not always easy to predict what's going to happen in the future when you start to make changes with stuff. And so there are people who say Bitcoin is pretty much good how it is, and we've achieved a ton of success. Why would we go mess with it? If you want to do these other things, create your own blockchain or create your own fork of Bitcoin and goof around with it. And if everybody decides that's the right thing, then people will migrate to it. But otherwise, leave my Bitcoin alone. That's been the discussion that's happening between different various players.
Well, I know that the developers of Bitcoin want to see blockchain used to make better solutions that exist in the world, and we're coming to a point in which things like settlement of stock trades are coming to a point where blockchain can offer solutions, and the stock exchanges see that. I mean, we know that Dallas is getting a stock exchange that's going to be settled on some sort of blockchain that they've talked about. We know that the likes of Citadel have talked about settlement on chain with regards to the New York Stock Exchange. So I would assume that Bitcoin wants to be the network that picks up those customers. Is the community really that much for ossification rather than adopting such use?
I think It's hard for me to represent both sides of this argument. It's what I said. There are people who want to do certain things. Like Paul wants to innovate on Bitcoin, doesn't want to use a different blockchain, loves the proof of work main layer, wants to create something that's apart from Bitcoin but is very close to it. And so something like that would be enabled if Bitcoin had some what he considers relatively minor changes to it. And so it's I think just a general drive towards doing some minimal amount of changes to Bitcoin that would enable for more innovative stuff, and trying to make the minimum set of changes possible. And then you've got some people that say we should go whole hog. Let's make Bitcoin more Turing complete. Let's make it have everything that it could possibly have that we see on other chains. Like, we know that these things don't cause the destruction of the chain, and that's been proved out by various blockchains that do have Turing complete smart contract programming languages, and that there's not really a fundamental issue with any of them. But it's just a big debate, and it's hard to represent both sides of it. But as far as like, do some people want to see stock trading enabled by the Bitcoin network? I'd say that there are some people who do, and then there's players like Larry Fink who probably don't care about that. Like, he'd rather just create his own technology and be able to be in complete control of it, and doesn't really care about it being a peer-to-peer thing at all. So it's kind of, what do you want from the world? Like, do you want it open and peer-to-peer and public, or are you okay with centralized players having some amount of technology and control over how it's working? And time will tell. We'll have to see who's right and what designs ultimately win out in the long term.
Well, in the long term, open peer-to-peer designs work, damn it. I guess I was also thinking as the option being like continuing to use Bitcoin with this as a strategic asset reserve, as digital gold, because I could see there are those who don't want to see Bitcoins or Satoshis being used for whatever transactions in layers over it that are gaining value. And I know that. Well, I guess a question to you: would you prefer to see Bitcoin as digital gold, or as I don't know, the go-to open peer-to-peer blockchain that has that handles all sorts of side chains and drive chains on it, or are those mutually exclusive? All right.
I think it's fine to have more programmability on Bitcoin. I wouldn't consider some of this other stuff to be spam. I think if you're willing to pay for the block, then fee infrastructure and fee pressure on Bitcoin is good for Bitcoin. So I would fall on the side of, let's try to make it a bit more programmable. Let's allow for these innovations to happen. And I've living in the world of Chia, I've seen what it's like to have almost unlimited ability to implement anything, and I just haven't seen that that leads to this world that people fear. So that's my thought on it. Is I think some of this stuff that's been proposed is probably going to be fine. Like, I think the fears are probably not well founded, and even the stuff that has been leveled against what has happened with SegWit is a little disingenuous. I wish that what could have been with all of that stuff that was happening with NFTs on Bitcoin would have been stronger, and that it would have been done with covenants. So that's my personal thought on it. Is I think it would have been fine, and I think we should add some of these opcodes into Bitcoin.
Well, I tend to agree. Anything else that you want to add? We're on the hour. Probably a good time to close it up otherwise.
No, I think it's a good place to close it up. So we just tried to have a pretty high level conversation about what are these different words, what's the differences between them. Didn't necessarily get into enumerating a lot of the ones that are out there right now, because in my opinion, they're all pretty experimental. A lot of these are still developing, and I would say as we're looking into the next couple of years is when we should start to see some of these things start to really come to the fray. But there are even some that have gotten pretty popular right now that we've talked about, like Base. Base is an Eltoo on Ethereum. So some of this stuff is definitely already gotten popular, but some of that comes with its own trade-offs. You know, if the L2 gets really popular and nobody uses the L1 anymore, then you start to end up in a really weird situation where, you know, you can no longer borrow from the security of the L1 to operate the L2. And that's maybe a bigger conversation for a different day. Is just how does the security model of L1s and L2s interact if the L2 becomes more popular than the L1?
I think that that would be an interesting conversation, and yeah, we've seen the price of Ethereum, or at least the transactions on Ethereum, dropping with the growth of the L2s on that chain. So, what's it going to take to keep the validators providing consensus security for it? Anyway, have a good weekend, and I enjoyed it. Thank you for educating me on L2s on Bitcoin.
All right, we'll see you next week.